The Holy Gospel today is from John, the first chapter, starting at the 43rd verse. Please stand and bow to your spirit. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. Jesus found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him about whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus, son of Joseph of Nazareth." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." When Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him, he said to him, "Here is truly an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael asked him, "Where did you get to know me?" And Jesus answered, "I saw you under the fig tree before Philip called you." Nathanael replied, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." And Jesus answered, "Do you believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Very truly, I tell you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." The Gospel of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
You may be seated. Grace, mercy, and peace to you from the triune God, source of light and love and unending joy. Amen. Well, this weekend, this Friday, was a monumental day. In the afternoon, I was walking through my house and realized there was nothing I had to do. It's been a long time probably since my sabbatical, where I was walking around and I realized I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to do anything in the moment for the church. I didn't have to do anything for my family. There wasn't anything like pressing on my to-do list. But it's a lovely feeling, isn't it? When you realize you can actually just relax. And Dave and I had already set aside Friday night because he's now working at a church, so we usually have 5 nights in a row where one of us has a meeting. So Friday night was our date night, and we decided to make soup together. We made a lovely cauliflower and leek soup, and then we decided to watch a movie, Netflix. And we watched a lovely historical fiction movie called All the Light We Cannot See. Has anyone seen this one yet? Read the book. The book is so much better. Cam says read the book. I haven't read the book, but I watched the movie. And for those of you who I will highly recommend it, I will not give away all of the details, but I'm going to share just a few because they're really, really good, and they connect so much with today. So this movie, it's of over 4 episodes. It's set in World War II, and it is the 2 characters kind of play this kind of like we go back and forth. They never meet each other until the very end, but these 2 characters, there is a young woman named Marie. She is blind. She grows up in Paris, and then there is a young German boy in an orphanage named Werner. And both of them at a young age, we don't know exactly if it's 6 or 7, but they're little. Both of them have a love of tuning into a frequency on the radio, 1310, turning to this frequency and listening to a professor late in the evening talk to children and teach them about biology and science and art and beauty. And you watch these kids. I mean, the scenes are beautiful. There's this sweet, sweet Marie laying in bed. Her eyes are shut, and she's got these big headphones on, and she's just listening. And then Werner is in his bed, and you can see all the beds in the orphanage, and there he is with a blanket over the top, and he's listening because he's not supposed to be listening. Because at the time that Werner was growing up, there were not to be anyone listening to any other radio stations other than what was the national radio station in Germany at that time. And so you have these kids growing up listening to the professor. As the story goes, Marie has to flee Paris, and because Werner is a young genius, he is at a very young age enlisted into the German army and had taken to the Eastern Front against his will. And then the story unfolds to the point that they finally meet at the very end, and that's all I'm going to say. There's lots of other details, but I will not get into that. But what I loved was how this professor, throughout their formation, like for years, would be teaching them. And at one point, and actually I'm going to go back in the story, at one point when she is very little, Marie, and she's listening to it, her dad's like, you got to go to bed. And she's like, I don't want to. He's like, well, you have to go to bed. And she said, well, I'm learning so much. And he said, what are you even learning? And this is what she said. Well, the light that comes when you burn coal or charcoal or peat, the professor said the light you get from a piece of coal is actually sunlight. The point is, light lasts forever. For 1 billion years inside a piece of coal. But darkness, the professor said, the darkness lasts not even for 1 second when you turn on the light. As both of these kids are growing up and listening to the professor, the world is crumbling and falling apart. And nations are, starting the World War II becomes to its height, and the movie is kind of set from 1941 to 1944 is where they zero in. And what I appreciated so much is that as both of them cued in to 1310, this frequency actually not only shaped their lives, but actually becomes the frequency that actually helps liberation come to this little French town. And what is beautiful is when the two finally meet each other after harrowing circumstances, and they come to find out that they both grew up listening to the professor. Young Werner, he turns to Marie and he says, the professor saved my life. He was like my father. And it's just good. Watch it. After just even thinking about it today, I was like, I gotta watch it again. It's a wonderful, wonderful movie. But it made me stop and think that what if prayer is like tuning into the frequency of God? Like that we tune in, that there's lots of frequencies, there's lots of noise that we have right now. I mean, I just think of the noise that I fill my life with. I've got 2 podcasts that I love watching. I'm listening to 3 audiobooks, and I've got 2 other books that I've got on the shelf. Between all of that, and that's not even just listening to the other NPR or other things that I might listen to. I've got a lot of noise coming at me. But it takes discipline for me. For me to be in spiritual practice, I actually have to sit myself down. I have to do some breathing exercises to finally get into a space to do centering prayer, to actually really listen to God and to be in a space where I can tune in to the frequency of God speaking to me. Today I want to talk about prayer, or listening to the voice of God. God's calling us as kind of a frequency that we tap into that changes us, that transforms us, like that frequency in the professor's voice changed these 2 young children. Now, in our story today, we have sweet Samuel, who tunes into the frequency of God. But actually, I want to share a little bit before. Samuel's mom, Hannah, she longed. It's a tender story at the beginning of Samuel. She longed to have a child, and she received ridicule from, not from her husband, but her husband had another wife who had many children. She was barren, and so she received ridicule from this other wife, but also culturally, she just did not feel whole, and so she would go into the temple and she would pray with anguish. And there was one time that she was even praying, and her lips were moving, but there wasn't any audible sound. And Eli, who was the priest at the time, looked over at her and just accused her of being drunk because she was moving her lips, but there was no voice. And she said, hey, I am praying to God. This is my prayer. I am heartbroken. I am praying to God. And he said, well, may it be according to God's will, that you might. And then I won't go into all the details. So he says, go and be blessed. And then the story goes on that Hannah and her husband then do conceive, and they have a child named Samuel, which actually means God hears. So Samuel then is entrusted to Eli as the priest. Sweet Hannah had said, if I have a child, I'm going to give this child back to you, God. And so think of Eli as a high priest, and he now has this young boy. We don't know how old, but young, who is now apprenticed. He is now listening and learning what it means to be a priest and a servant of God. And we have in the story that was just read, in the story that sweet Samuel has not even understood what the voice of God sounds like yet. He has not tuned into the frequency of God. So every time he would hear, Samuel, Samuel, he would get up and go running to Eli and say, here I am. And Samuel's like, I was dead asleep. I did not call you. Go back to bed. And so 3 times that happens, and then finally Eli wises up and says, no, when you hear this voice, say, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. And that's what happens. God, I love the part where you read that God actually stands right in front of Samuel and says, speaks to him, and Samuel responds, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. And then he becomes this prophet that speaks the word of God for the rest of his life. There are many others within our scriptures, our holy sacred texts, who listen, who tap into the frequency of God. I think of Moses. Moses, who it was the voice of God, but also a burning bush that eventually, even as he protested and said, I just won't even have the words, I'm going to stutter, finally he said with his life, here I am, send me. Or Jeremiah, who thought he was too young, but eventually he said with his very life, here I am, send me. Or Mary, we walked with her this whole story of Advent. When the angel Gabriel comes to her and says that she is going to conceive in her womb the Messiah, she says, let it be with me according to your word. And then disciples. We have Philip and we have Nathaniel. They too, they have this come and see, and then with their lives, they will continue to say, here I am, Lord, send me. Sojourner Truth. I mean, we could list off person after person. Sojourner Truth heard the voice of God. She tuned into the frequency of God, that she was to lead her people to freedom through the Underground Railroad. And she responded to God with every step, here I am, send me. Or Rosa Parks listened to the voice to call her to the front of the bus, not the back of the bus. And she said with her life, here I am, send me. Mother Teresa, did you know that she washed dishes for 40 years before she started her ministry of caring for those on the streets in Calcutta? That's a long time to pray. That's a long time to wait to hear the voice of God. Martin Luther King Jr. heard the cry for racial reconciliation, economic justice, and an end to segregation and systematic racism. And he said with his life, here I am, send me. And this still voice of God is still calling us to come and to see, to follow Jesus and respond with a resounding, here I am, send me. I love this story that we have of the calling of Philip and Nathaniel, because we have the voice of God coming, but if we read it too fast, it just goes super fast. So I want to pause for a moment and help us just notice a few things. Philip, I mean, my gosh, Jesus does not have to do any warm-up. He just says, follow me, and Philip's like, okay, and he just comes along. So Philip's probably been primed, who knows? But sweet Nathaniel, when Philip says, come and meet the Messiah, Nathaniel, he says this, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Have you ever had this happen before? When someone questions, or maybe you've witnessed this when you've heard someone question someone's credibility from where they have come from or the school they went to, or I grew up in Lodi, California. Creedence Clearwater Revival in 1969 wrote a song called Stuck in Lodi. Let's say I was the brunt of many jokes growing up. And when I had said yes to St. Matthew's, that I was going to come and move to Renton, Dave and I were in line at a lovely little kind of outdoor fish place where you get fish tacos in Minneapolis. It was a beautiful sunny day, and we were standing in line, and I heard the people behind me say that they were, they mentioned Seattle, they lived in Seattle, and I turned, I'm like, oh, I just accepted a job there. I'm going to be moving there in the next month. And I was like wide-eyed and super excited, and they were like, oh, so where are you moving? I said, well, I'm moving to Renton. And they went, oh. Renton. And they said it with that, Renton. And then they really didn't want to talk to me. And I did have a few moments of panic. I was like, what did I just get myself into? But then I realized we all have a little bit of bias sometimes. And I met that bias, and I got here and realized, yeah, the goodness and grace of God and the gloriousness of Renton. But Nathanael says, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Like anyone worth listening to? Anyone worth following? And Philip, I love, he said, just come and see. Come and see. And then when he meets Jesus, Jesus proclaims to know him before he's even seen him. And it says that Jesus, he was sitting under a fig tree. And I have read this story so many times, but I've missed the detail that he's sitting under a fig tree. I thought, what would he be doing under a fig tree? Was it hot and he needed some shade? Or maybe that's where he went every day to pray. Maybe the fig tree was his kind of sacred space where he would look out over the land and he would contemplate like nature. I don't know about you, but I have a certain places where I finally get up to the peak and I look out and I am like caught by the grace and the love of God that I can't not unsee. Maybe Nathanael had been tapping into God for a long time, listening to the frequency of God's voice, so much so that when then he finally met Jesus, he went, oh, you are the Messiah. Because he'd already been listening to this voice, and this voice was one of liberation and one of knowing him. At the early service, we read a beautiful psalm, Psalm 139, which talks about that I knew you in your mother's womb, for you are fearfully and wonderfully made. What does the voice of God sound like? Actually, Dave and I got into a whole big debate yesterday. I feel for my children who have had two parents for their whole lives, when sometimes Dave was talking about what does it mean to have a relationship with Jesus, and I'm like, what does that even mean? What does that mean? And then he would ask me a question, I'm like, well, I don't even know. And we went back and forth about what is this? And finally, we started talking about, well, what does the voice of God sound like? How can you tell the difference between all the other voices? How can you delineate what really is the voice of God? So that was our conversation last night, both of us needing to preach this morning. And we came to this kind of coalescing together, that the voice of God is the voice that is always going to be bringing us toward freedom, reminding us of our belovedness, reminding us of the human flourishing, that God is a God of death and resurrection, words of hope, words of comfort, words of compassion, words that remind us that we are not alone. Oh, shoot, I forgot one thing. I was supposed to bring this up here with me. And in the midst of our conversation, talking about the voice of God, it brought me back to some books I've read recently on Thomas Merton. And I've been taking copious notes in my journal. And this is what Thomas Merton says: when we sit in contemplation, we sit in silence with God, and I want to add, we tap in and we are listening to the frequency of God. He says this: when we sit in practice, in silence, we are not alone. We are sitting with people from all over the world. We're sitting in oneness with the holiness of the human family. The whole family is woven together in God. All are held together in God and in the love of God. I don't know about you, but that's what I want to keep tapping into. I want to keep listening to the voice of God, to the frequency of God that reminds me of who I am and who you are. And reminds me of what this call means to follow and to listen. It's this deep, deep love that is all-consuming, that reminds me that we are one in God and we are called to help everyone experience freedom and wholeness and life. I don't pray perfectly. I am still learning, and there are times that I sit in silence and I wonder what in the world I'm doing. But I keep turning to prayer I keep turning to God because I want to tap in and I want to hear the voice of God that I know is there. Like those two kids long to hear the professor's voice at 13:10. And so may we continue to listen in, to find spaces and postures where we can hear the voice of God that reminds us of who we are and who each other are, and that we are not alone. Amen.